Good morning, Ospreys. Good morning, everybody. I am John OLoughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives. And this morning we are doing a morning reading of one of the books that I've selected. This one, Cassidy's Run by David Wise. And I was thinking, it's too bad I can't have a consistent time slot for each of the books that I read. But the fact is, with scheduling guests and certain calendar restrictions, it's not possible. So I'm some people that can't hear me live in the evening may be able to hear me live in the morning, and vice versa. But maybe some people will have to catch up by listening to the replay. But that's okay, because everything's going to be available, not only on YouTube, as long as they can stand to have me, and then, of course, we're also over republishing on BitChute, but we also have the live broadcast going to Facebook, where that is an archive as well, and Periscope and a couple others. So it's not hard to find us anymore, thanks to the production that we're getting from Neighborhood News Studio, and Aaron Adler working the dials and knobs this morning, doing a great job. Aaron. And Twitch. Don't forget Twitch. Now here's the thing. I've been starting to get seduced by Twitch. I don't understand it, because I opened it up one time, and all I saw was what appears to be a whole lot of sophisticated games, online games, kind of like those Grand Theft Auto and World of Warcraft things. And I don't know. I mean, maybe that's a way to get into certain people's heads over there. But the other thing about Twitch is it does have some way to do some kind of monetization, which is what's attractive to those of us that have been kicked off of YouTube and demonetized, as this channel has been a couple of times. And that's, if you start doing productions and you expect to have a little bit of money on to pay for what you do, and it's gone, well, if Twitch presents an option, then I'm interested. So perhaps Andy, Aaron and I can talk after the show about what that option might be to really make Twitch the center of my production, as opposed to old tube. All right, so I think it's great that we can just read through this narrative story about a couple of FBI agents back in 1959, and we'll get some more background on Mr. Joe Cassidy in chapter 4 as we start. He was born in Erie, Pennsylvania. So let's start off reading here, chapter 4 of Cassidy's Run: The Secret Spy War Over Nerve Gas. Chapter 4, Orange Peels for Breakfast. Joe Cassidy's earliest memories are of the orphanage to which he was sent at age 3, an institution with the grim Dickensian name of Home for the Friendless. Wow. He was born on June 25th, 1920, the same year as my dad, by the way, in Erie, Pennsylvania, the third of 5 children. His father was a foreman at the electric company. Quote, "My mother died from TB when I was about 3 years old," unquote, Cassidy recounted. "My youngest sister Maxine died, I'm told, shortly after birth. I do not remember my mother or my young sister. I faintly recall being at the gravesite at the burial of my mother, and someone gave each of us a ring." His father, suddenly a widower and unable to care for the children, placed Cassidy and an older brother and sister in the Home for the Friendless. Cassidy's younger sister Shirley was taken in by a childless couple. Cassidy and his siblings hated the orphanage. "My breakfast every morning all those years consisted of a bowl of milk with pieces of bread broken into it. It wasn't enough for a growing boy. He supplemented his diet by scavenging for scraps, even garbage. I can remember finding discarded orange peels, which I washed off and ate. I was hungry much of the time. Two stern overseers, Miss Moon and Miss Richardson, ran the orphanage. We were given chores to do, and one of mine was to make beds. I would leave breakfast early, and on the way to the dorm, I'd pass a cabinet where food was kept. The keys were almost always left in the lock. I would sneak in there and find something to eat. Cassidy was so little at the time that he had to stand on a stool to reach the forbidden food. One morning I took a banana. I had eaten about half of it when Miss Moon entered the dorm. I shoved the banana under the mattress. She came over to me and sat down, and the half-eaten banana squished through the peel and then through the metal springs and plopped onto the floor. Miss Moon heard the banana fall and really gave me hell, and from then on, the keys were never left in the lock. The Home for the Friendless was a frugal place, and its officialdom had calculated that the orphans' shoes would wear out more slowly if they were worn only in winter. During the summers, we were made to go barefoot, which I hated. I was always stubbing my big toe. To this day, I don't like to go barefoot except in the shower or in bed. About the only happy moments for Cassidy were on Sundays when his father visited. His father brought a big bag of candy, but he was required to hand it over to Miss Moon or Miss Richardson, who divided it up among the children. Cassidy and his brother and sister complained to their father that they had little enough to eat. But there was no place to hide from the formidable Miss Moon, since anyone coming to see the orphans was restricted to a community visiting area. My dad's solution was to bring the Sunday funnies, and with me on his lap and my brother and sister beside me, he would open the paper in front of him and read us the funnies while we hid behind the paper and ate the candy. After 5 years in the orphanage, Cassidy and his siblings got a reprieve. His brother Robert was about to become a teenager, which meant he was too old for the Home for the Friendless. My dad persuaded his mother, who lived in Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, to come to Erie and provide a home for us. To Cassidy, by now age 8, his grandmother was like an angel of deliverance. No more sodden bread for breakfast, no more orange peels. There was plenty of love and togetherness. We all finally got to know each other. In the orphanage, my sister lived with the girls. My brother was with the older boys, separated from me. We would see each other from time to time, but it wasn't family. At long last, in his grandmother's house, Cassidy could enjoy a normal childhood. For a boy who had literally been starved for years, the corner grocery store was nirvana. We found out that the grocery store carried a running tab for families in the neighborhood. My dad paid the bill every 2 weeks on payday. Well, I thought this was great. On the way to school in the morning, I would stop in and get a dozen chocolate cookies. Next time, it was 2 bananas, or an orange and 2 apples. The boy, still psychologically conditioned by his years in the orphanage, worried that someone might examine the grocery bill and confront him, but his father never said a word. As a teenager growing up during the Depression years, Cassidy got into the usual boyhood mischief, none of it serious. When he was 14, his father remarried, and his grandmother moved to her own apartment. A year later, while in the ninth grade, Cassidy asked his father if he could quit school. He finally agreed if I had a job. Cassidy found one at $4 a week, working for the Mailer Beverage Company, up to 65 hours a week as a helper on a soft drink truck. Cassidy's hometown, although the largest city in Pennsylvania, had none of the historic importance and social distinction of Philadelphia, and none of the wealth and power of Pittsburgh. Situated on Lake Erie in the far northwest corner of the state, Erie was geographically cut off from the rest of Pennsylvania. It was an industrial town with harsh, frigid winters that brought huge snowdrifts, and that seemed to last half the year. But if life in Erie was lackluster and the hours on the job long, anything was an improvement over the orphanage. And Cassidy soon found work much flashier than hauling root beer. His best friend, Ray Daly, knew Jack Paris, who owned a local nightclub. Although prohibition had been repealed 2 years earlier, admittance to the Paris Social and Athletic Club was speakeasy style. To enter, you rang a bell at the top of the stairs, and an 8-inch slot would open and a buzzer was pressed to let you in. They had slot machines and pool tables in the rear, up over the Richmond Brothers Clothier on State Street, and we went there often to shoot pool. Then we got to watching the floor show on Saturday nights. Soon it evolved to helping out at the bar when they were very busy, washing glasses, etc. One night I was asked by a patron to fix a couple of Tom Collinses, and before long I was a regular bartender. Jack was quite an entrepreneur. He was raised in a poor Italian family and not only owned the club, but a model and a hobby supply store, which I ran for a while, and a neon sign company. We became good friends, and a lot of times he would give me his Packard to drive some of the showgirls home. For a 16-year-old, tooling down State Street with showgirls in a fancy car was definitely a step up from hauling soft drinks. But Cassidy did not entirely neglect the spiritual. Although my family was Presbyterian and we went to a Presbyterian Sunday school, all of my friends were Catholic. On Saturday night, we'd tend bar, work all night, and then go to Mass. We ran 2 floor shows, the last one at 2 a.m. We'd close at 5:30, wash glasses, and straighten up the place. We would leave the bar at 5:45, run over to the cathedral a few blocks away for 6 o'clock Mass, and then back to Clark's restaurant for breakfast on Jack's Tab. I've gone to Catholic church ever since." Unquote. Pardon me. By now, Cassidy had a steady girl, Ray Daly's sister, Pat. We always bought the 5-cent new song list each week, and we listened to the Lucky Strike Hit Parade together on the radio. These were Depression days. Wages were low, but we could buy ground beef 4 pounds for a quarter. My grandmother helped me buy a car for $35. Gas was 7 or 8 cents a gallon, and they cleaned your windshield and checked your oil and tires. When Cassidy was 18, he found work at Erie Forge and Steel Company as a laborer laying railroad ties. It was tough work, but soon the war in Europe brought better jobs at higher wages. Cassidy was offered a job as a third helper on the open hearth furnace, wearing dark glasses and long-sleeved wool shirts to protect themselves from the intense heat. The helpers shoveled sand into the furnace to repair holes caused by the extremely high temperatures. There were about 5 guys in a circle taking turns, Cassidy recalled. When the furnace's hydraulic doors opened, a machine called a charger fed scrap metal into the flames. What comes out is molten steel. After a few months, Cassidy was promoted to second helper. He still had to shovel sand into the furnace, but now he also got to tap it out. When it's time to tap it out, you open up the back of the furnace. You poke an air hose into the back of the furnace until the molten metal starts to pour. The crane operator takes the ladle and pours it into an ingot about 15 feet by 6 feet. It was hard work, but by now Cassidy was a rugged, handsome young adult. After Pearl Harbor, the steel plant was working overtime, and Cassidy's friends were going off to war. Because his job was considered essential to the war effort, there was little chance he would be drafted, but Cassidy chafed to join up. By late 1942, most of my buddies were in the service, and one of my best friends had already been killed. I told the personnel office I'd like not to be exempt from military service at my next call up. They honored my request, and I was drafted in February 1943. Private Cassidy reported to Fort Lee in Petersburg, Virginia, for basic training, and then was selected to attend school to become a drill instructor. He rose rapidly through the ranks, and after a year he was promoted to first sergeant, skipping several grades. Cassidy also got engaged to Pat Daly, but he did not often go home to Erie to see her because of the expense and lack of leave time. Hilda Marie Prince, a young woman from Petersburg who worked in the PX, noticed the good-looking sergeant. When Cassidy's grandmother died in the late summer of 1943, Prince heard about it and urged Cassidy to stop by before he left on emergency leave for the funeral. He did. She had a bag of food for me to take on the trip. Cassidy was touched by the gesture. When he returned, they dated and were married after the war. 11 months later, we had a daughter, Shelby Jean, but Cassidy's marriage to Hilda went rapidly downhill. As I look back now, I do believe she saw me as a ticket out of the burg, Petersburg, that is, because the marriage was a bust right from the start. In 1947, Cassidy was transferred to the 1st Cavalry Division in Japan and detailed to the 302nd Reconnaissance Company. His wife and daughter remained in the States. After a year, he was shipped back to Fort Lee, where he remained until 1952 when he was assigned to the Far East Command. The Korean War was underway, and Cassidy, again without his wife, was sent to Japan, expecting he would end up in Korea. Instead, he was detached from his unit and assigned to Kokura, Japan, as an administrator in the office that identified the remains of GIs killed in action and shipped them home for burial. It was a grim but fortunate assignment for Cassidy. Almost everyone in his old outfit was killed in the war. A year later, the Army allowed dependents to join their spouses in Japan. Hilda and Shelby Jean arrived in Kokura. Hilda was finally out of Petersburg, but she was unhappy in Japan. She wanted to return home, but took a job in the PX and stayed on until Cassidy's tour ended in 1955. They returned to the States and bought a home in the Strawberry Hills section of Alexandria, Virginia. That December, a son, Mary J., was born into their cheerless marriage. Cassidy was assigned to a clerical job in the Adjutant General's office at nearby Fort Belvoir. It was dreary work, and when Cassidy heard of an opening at the base's nuclear field office, he applied and was accepted. The office supervised a school for nuclear power plant operators, as well as the Belvoir power plant itself. In April 1959, Cassidy earned a high school general equivalency degree 24 years after he had dropped out of the 9th grade. 4 months later, he was called into interview for the interview that was to change his life forever. Joe Cassidy, nightclub bartender, steelworker, and career Army man, unexpectedly metamorphosed into Wallflower, a neophyte spy and counter-espionage agent for the FBI, working against the highly trained professional officers of the Glavnoye Ravz... I've never practiced this one. Let's just call it the GRU. On the face of it, the match seemed unequal. Could an amateur such as Cassidy really be expected to fool the Russians? If the Soviets ever discovered the truth, they might retaliate against him. He was playing a potentially dangerous game. If he lost, he realized he might just end up dead. Chapter 5, Recontact. When Cassidy left for Korea in September 1960, he told the second Mike that he expected to return in December 1961, but he did not make it back until February 1962. The FBI, anxious to keep Cassidy in play against the Soviets, wanted him near Washington. The arrangements were made quietly. Much later, Cassidy was told that his records had been flagged. He was not to be given new assignments by the Army in the usual manner. Cassidy received orders to report from Korea to the Maryland Air National Guard office at Edgewood Arsenal on the Chesapeake Bay, 14 miles east of Baltimore. Cassidy landed in San Francisco and took a bus across the country. He had hoped the time away might improve relations with his wife. It did not. When I got back to Alexandria, I called my wife and she picked me up. At the house, I said, "I've been assigned to Edgewood." "Well," she said, "you're going to be assigned there by yourself. I'm not going with you." So I slept on the couch that night. Angered and disappointed, but not entirely surprised by the final breakup of his family, Cassidy reported to Edgewood. After he found a furnished apartment, he drove to Newport News, Virginia, to get his teenage daughter, who was living with an uncle. His son, now 6, stayed with his mother. As soon as Cassidy and his daughter were settled at Edgewood, he got in touch with the FBI. His bureau handlers fretted that the Army's delay in returning him to the States might have spooked the Russians. Although it was 2 months later than planned, the FBI decided to have Cassidy follow his instructions for recontacting the GRU. There was little else the Bureau could do. Pardon me. Cassidy drove from Edgewood and crushed the crayon in front of the photography store in downtown Washington. The next day, as instructed, with pipe in mouth and book in hand, he strolled along a residential street in Maryland. But no Soviet spy appeared to inquire about the nearest movie theater. For several months, until May or June, Cassidy dutifully crushed crayons in front of the photo store on the designated days and walked the specified street with pipe and book. Nothing happened. The Bureau tried different ways to recontact the Soviets, Cassidy said. They put up an index card on the Y, at the Y, saying, quote, "Lost watch," and it gave my name and phone number at Edgewood. There was no response. Finally, in August 1963, the FBI tried a risky and unorthodox ploy. Quote, "Don Grunzel came up with the idea. I met him in Washington one day. He wrote a note that said, 'I'm back from Korea,' and gave the telephone number of my office at Edgewood. It said, 'I'm the person you were involved with at Belvoir.'" We got in his car and drove to 16th Street across from the Russian embassy. There were some kids, maybe 10 or 12 years old, playing on the street. He called one over and gave him the note and told him to deliver it to the embassy and give it to whoever came to the door. Don gave him 50 cents. I said, "Maybe you should have given him the 50 cents when he came back." From where we were parked, we were in a position to see what happened. We watched the kid deliver the note. The person who opened the door didn't look around. He took the note and went inside. Not many days afterward, Cassidy was in his office in Edgewood when he received a phone call. It was a foreigner speaking very slow in a low voice. He said he was glad I had returned from Korea, and he arranged a time and a place for a meet near Greenbelt, Maryland. Wallflower was back in business. The meeting took place on September 19th. This time, neither Polikarpov nor Fursa appeared. A third Russian, Boris G. Kolodyanzhny, apologize, Boris, let's just call him Boris, showed up. He was listed as first secretary of the Soviet embassy, but to Cassidy, predictably, he introduced himself as Mike. Cassidy's assignment to the National Guard was of little interest to Kolodyansky. Kolodyanyi Boris. But the GRU officer was well aware of the main activity at Edgewood, the Army's Chemical Warfare Center. There, in the laboratories at Edgewood, Army scientists operating under the tightest secrecy experimented with and developed the nerve gases that were the most lethal agents in the nation's controversial arsenal of chemical weapons. The Russians now believed they were close to achieving one of their prime objectives, penetrating a major U.S. defense activity. From their perspective, Cassidy's new assignment proved that even a non-commissioned officer was worth recruiting, because he might, in time, have access to information of enormous value. The GRU man pressed Cassidy. He knew what was at Edgewood. He wanted to know about the chemical center. I told him I didn't know anything. The Bureau set out to remedy the problem. It began orchestrating Cassidy's transfer to the nerve gas laboratory, a process that took several months. In October, Cassidy met again with the GRU. This time, yet another officer showed up. His name was Mikhail Danilin, and he was to become Cassidy's principal Russian handler. The fourth, Mike, served as Cassidy's Soviet control for 8 years, longer than any of the others. On the State Department's diplomatic list, he appeared as an attaché in the cultural section, and later as an embassy third secretary. As was the case with his predecessors, he was an officer with the GRU. At 6'1", Danilin was a big man, as tall as Cassidy. He was soft-spoken, quiet, handsome, and dark-haired. He, too, pressed Cassidy for everything he could learn about nerve gas. They met again 3 times in the spring of 1964. As Cassidy recalled it, the strings for his move to the nerve gas laboratory were pulled by Special Agent James F. Jimmy Morrissey, who later succeeded Don Grunsel as his case agent. A short, clever Boston Irishman, Morrissey was a leprechaun with a law degree, a fanatic Red Sox fan, and a man of great charm with a natural talent for counterintelligence. Quote, Morrissey brought a guy from Army personnel to talk to me, Cassidy said. Soon after, Cassidy was recommended for promotion, and on June the 10th, he moved into a slot in the Weapons Development and Engineering Labs, WDEL, at Edgewood, known as Weedle. The companion lab at Edgewood, the Defense Developing Engineering Labs, DDEL, was called Deedle. In October, Danilin met again with Cassidy. The GRU officer was, of course, delighted to hear that Cassidy had been transferred to the weapons lab. Cassidy was where the Russians wanted him. Danilin asked where Cassidy worked in the lab and what documents he saw. He bombarded Cassidy constantly with all sorts of questions about nerve gas. He was interested in formulas and methods of delivery, Cassidy said. Danilin also inquired about incapacitants developed at Edgewood, such as BZ, which can cause disorientation and temporary paralysis, and riot control agents such as CS. His main interest, however, as might be expected, was nerve gas. Cassidy was not a scientist. He had never even gone to college. But one of his jobs at the weaponry laboratory was to file the documents produced by the chemists and the engineers. The strange Lovian world in which Cassidy now found himself was one that operated in deepest secrecy, with almost no public knowledge of its existence. Nerve gases are among the more horrible weapons ever developed, no less deadly than nuclear bombs and biological agents such as anthrax, Ebola virus, or the bubonic plague. A tiny drop of nerve gas, inhaled or in contact with the skin, can kill almost instantly. Closely related to common insecticides, nerve gases were unknown until the approach of World War II. Appropriately, they were first developed by the Nazis. In 1936, Dr. Gerhard Schrader, that's Schrader, a chemist with IG Farben in Germany, had discovered the first nerve gas by accident while researching compounds to kill insects. He synthesized an organophosphorus ester known as tabun, or GA. Soon, Schrader and Nazi scientists were developing far more powerful nerve gases, sarin, also known as GB, which Schrader discovered in 1938, and Soman, S-O-M-A-N, known as GD. The Nazis built a nerve gas production plant in Breslau, disguising its output under the code name Trilon, a popular soap. At the end of the war, the Soviets captured German stocks of nerve gas, dismantled the plant in Breslau, and transported it back to the Soviet Union. U.S. Army intelligence found Dr. Schrader, however, and obtained the nerve gas formulas from him. As a result, American scientists too were able to replicate tabun, sarin, and soman. In the 1950s, British and American scientists developed another powerful nerve gas, VX. By the 1960s, both the United States and the Soviet Union had extensive chemical and biological warfare programs, CBW, which were important targets for intelligence operations. Edgewood was a prime objective for the Soviets, as were Fort Detrick, Maryland, the government's Center for Germ Warfare Research, and Dugway Proving Grounds, a huge restricted area about 60 miles southwest of Salt Lake City that tested both chemical and biological weapons. That's called Dugway Proving Grounds, and it's a new one for me. I don't know if you all are already familiar with it, but something to me for a footnote to look a little more into. Sarin, soman, and VX remain the world's three principal nerve gases today. All three work by inhibiting the action of cholinesterase, a key enzyme that controls the body's nervous system, including breathing, brain function, and muscle movement. Cholinesterase neutralizes the buildup of acetylcholine, a nerve impulse transmitter in the body. Acetylcholine must be present for an impulse or message to jump from one nerve ending to the next. This is how humans are able to think, breathe, and move. But when nerve gas inhibits the production of cholinesterase, nothing neutralizes the acetylcholine, and the nervous system, in effect, runs on fast forward, spinning wildly out of control. As one government official put it, all three nerve gases work by making people forget to breathe. The respiratory muscles convulse, and death follows, generally from asphyxiation. The term nerve gas is a misnomer since the chemicals are actually liquids delivered in a fine mist by an aerosol spray. Sarin has perhaps become the best known nerve gas, in part because it was used by the Aum Shinrikyo cult in a terrorist attack on the Tokyo subways during the morning rush hour on March 20th, 1995, killing 12 persons and injuring 5,000. In parentheses, 2 months later, the cult leader Shoko Asahara was captured and charged in the attack along with 40 of his followers, close parentheses. I'm going to go down now at the bottom of the page and read a couple of the footnotes to what I just read. Footnote 2 says, something went terribly wrong at Dugway during a nerve gas test on March 14, 1968. Some 6,400 sheep were killed in 2 Utah valleys, apparently by a cloud of VX. Although the Army has never officially taken responsibility for the sheep kill, it has skirted close to an admission. A month after the sheep died, the Army said evidence, quote, points to the Army's involvement, unquote. In January 1998, Colonel John Como, Dugway's commander, said that a test of a lethal chemical agent at Dugway may have contributed to the deaths of the sheep. Despite the Army's half denials, the government compensated the ranchers for their lost animals. And footnote 3, atropine, a derivative of the deadly belladonna plant, is a principal antidote to nerve gas. Belladonna which means beautiful lady in Italian, is a highly poisonous plant of the nightshade family with purple or red flowers. Another antidote is 2-PAM, prolidoxime chloride, one of a class of chemicals known as oximes that restore the normal action of cholinesterase. 2-PAM, however, is ineffective against SOMAN, the GD, after 2 minutes. Both atropine and 2-PAM, along with an injector, are contained in the Mark I kits provided to U.S. troops. All nerve gases are organophosphorus compounds. Although they are lethal, they have different properties and varying degrees of effectiveness. Some, for example, require smaller doses than others to kill people. Some nerve gases penetrate clothing better than others. Scientists also speak of persistent or non-persistent agents. That is, some more volatile gases, such as sarin, evaporate quickly and are considered non-persistent. Others, such as VX, evaporate much more slowly and can remain in an area still deadly for a week or two. Sarin, GB, is a colorless, odorless liquid. A 1996 material safety data sheet issued by the Army's Chemical and Biological Defense Command at Edgewood states that, quote, effective dosages for vapor are for exposure during durations of 2 to 10 minutes, unquote. Soman is described as a colorless liquid with a fruity odor, with impurities amber or dark brown with oil of camphor odor. Like sarin, it can kill in 2 to 10 minutes. VX is odorless, but unlike sarin and Soman, it is viscous with the consistency of motor oil. It can be colorless or slightly yellowish. One drop on the skin kills. The Army's safety data sheet warns, quote, death usually occurs within 15 minutes after absorption of a fatal dosage. Bernard Zeffert, a former chemist at Edgewood, perfected VX for the Army. Quote, we got VX from the Brits who created it, he said. When people in the process lab were gearing up for production of VX, they got poor results. Zeffert and Jefferson Davis Jr. tackled the problem. Quote, we conducted an experiment and published a paper, in-house only, on the bond energies of phosphorus and sulfur. As a result of their work, Zeffert and Davis received a patent, along with the Army, for a link in the process of making a precursor of VX. Davis, who had a master's degree in chemistry when he entered the Army in 1954, was sent to Edgewood. In his early 20s, he suddenly found himself making nerve gas. Quote, among the GIs, there was a sort of black humor about it, Davis recalled. We'll do what the Army wants for 2 years, unquote. The scientists on the permanent staff of Edgewood Arsenal had a pleasant life. Their laboratories were located on a scenic wooded peninsula that stretches into the northern end of the Chesapeake Bay, south of Havre de Grace. They lived in nearby towns like Bel Air, comfortable suburbs of Baltimore. They married, raised children, and went to work in their labs, making some of the deadliest concoctions known to humankind. Few would admit to any qualms about their work. Like some nuclear scientists, many found justification in the fact that the Soviet Union also had chemical and biological weapons. Soviet scientists thought much the same way. By and large, it was a we better keep up kind of mentality, recalled Davis, later the chairman of the chemistry department at the University of South Florida. We had a sense of duty at the time, but Davis said his own views have changed. The more you learn, the more you wonder about the saneness of it all. I think later a lot of people were not happy that that sort of stuff should be developed or used. I feel we should destroy the reserves of nerve gas and never use it, unquote. But the disenchantment Davis felt later was not typical. Many of the scientists at Edgewood argued that using nerve gas was actually a more humane and sure way to kill enemy soldiers than leaving them bleeding to death on a battlefield. When the Edgewood scientists retired, many continued to live around Bel Air as they slipped into their 70s and 80s. They remained in the close-knit group. Benjamin L. Harris had been technical director of the Army's chemical labs for 11 years when he left Edgewood in 1981. The retired nerve gas scientists, he said, formed a club called the Gobs for good old boys. In the early 1990s, the good old boys still met in Edgewood every Friday at Vitali's restaurant in a motel at the junction of Route 24 and I-95. By 1997, their ranks had dwindled to 4. Now they meet at Denny's across the road. Not all the ex-scientists at Edgewood joined the Gobs. Saul Hormats was definitely not a member of the club. White-haired and bespectacled in his mid-80s, when interviewed for this book, Hormats was a maverick who had broken with his fellow scientists and publicly opposed the development and use of nerve gas. Born in Troy, New York, he grew up in Baltimore, earned a chemical engineering degree at Johns Hopkins University in 1931, and 3 years later started at Edgewood. He worked for 37 years, serving as deputy director and then director of development before he retired in 1972. Not one given to false modesty, he described himself as, quote, the godfather of chemical warfare in the United States, unquote. Hormats explained how Edgewood would organized into a research group which worked on the nerve gases and a development section which designed a production facility. Production plants were scattered around the country, one at Pine Bluffs, Arkansas, for example. We ran toxicity tests on animals, mostly mice and dogs. It was done by our medical division. We had to make damn sure the stuff was stable, effective, not flammable, etc. It was then put into a 155 millimeter shell, and sometimes an 8-inch shell, or a 4.2 mortar shell, all with GB. Just to the north of Edgewood Arsenal is the Army's Aberdeen Proving Ground, a weapons test area. Aberdeen would take a shell and fire it to see the trajectory, strictly for munitions testing. Target effects were all done at Dugway, said Hormats. At Edgewood, the scientists concentrated primarily on sarin, GB, but they progressed to more compounds designated with letters of the alphabet beyond GA, tabun, and GB. They skipped over GC for fear that it might be confused with phosgene, CG, an older poison gas used widely in World War I. The Edgewood chemists also experimented with soman, GD, and conducted research on a nerve gas designated only as GE, an ethyl version of sarin. They experimented as well with cyclosarin, GF, a colorless, odorless nerve gas that is apparently as lethal as its cousins. According to Jeff Smart, Edgewood's official historian, we only standardized GB. We decided to declare it the main agent and produce it on a large scale. Although no one at Edgewood would confirm it, there is some evidence that the scientists also may have conducted research into GH, a nerve gas that combines an organophosphorus compound with isopentyl alcohol. The chemists at Edgewood were not content with this research. They strove at great length and at considerable expense to develop an even more powerful nerve gas. In the end, however, the technical problems they encountered were insurmountable. But this failure was to become the core of Operation Shocker. From the questions the GRU had asked Cassidy, it was clear that the Soviets were anxious to know which nerve gases were being produced and put into weapons. Had the United States decided to choose one of the 3 gases, or was it developing more than one? The GRU was also eager to discover whether the United States was developing a binary system to deliver nerve gases. In a binary system, the chemicals that combine to form the nerve gas are kept separate, in two compartments in an artillery shell, for example, and mix only on approach to a target. A binary system is a much safer way to store the gas and reduces the danger to pilots and troops who must handle it. Moscow also wanted to know if the scientists at Edgewood might be working on a newer and even deadlier form of nerve gas. At the meeting in May 1965, Danilin asked Cassidy to find out the formula for the version of VX produced in the Edgewood lab. He gave Cassidy a hollow battery as a concealment device, as well as a specially treated sheet of carbon paper for secret writing. The carbon would enable Cassidy to send a message to the Russians on what appeared to be a blank piece of paper. As it turned out, in asking Cassidy for information about binary weapons, the GRU was inquiring into matters at the cutting edge of American nerve gas technology. According to William C. Dee, that's DEE, a veteran official at Edgewood, Ben Witten, chief of organic research at the facility, came up with the concept of a binary system in 1957 in a test chamber at Edgewood, and in field tests of VX at Dugway, it worked. Saul Hormats, however, stopped the development of binary weapons in the 1960s. It was put on ice by me for two reasons, he said, so that other countries wouldn't get it. I didn't want third world nations making them in a barn in the boondocks. And second, it had no military value whatsoever. With the straight GB, you had more agent in the shell. It is more efficient than the binary. The binary shell is a base ejection shell, which means the nerve gas shoots out of the back of the shell and goes up in the air. With unitary munition, it bursts right on the target. It's a different kind of shell, and it works better. The United States did not begin production of binary artillery shells until 1985, almost 2 decades later. By the late 1980s, 155mm binary shells containing sarin were being produced, Dee said, each containing 6.5 pounds of the gas. I was furious when Reagan revived binary weapons, said Hormats, but by that time, of course, he had retired and left Edgewood. In March 1966, Danilin gave Cassidy a rollover camera, a spy gadget developed by the Soviets to copy documents that was a kind of predecessor of today's handheld scanners. The camera was about the size of a pack of cigarettes, Cassidy recalled, but not as thick. Cassidy simply rolled the camera over the document and it automatically took a picture. He could capture an entire page in 3 passes of the camera. Cassidy did not have to extract the film. I would give the whole camera to the Soviets and exchange it for a new one. Over time, the GRU gave Cassidy 3 rollover cameras. FBI technicians examined these cameras, and one detail bothered Charles Bevels. They all had high serial numbers, he recalled. I wondered, who else has these things? An indication of the GRU's trust in Cassidy was the fact that Danilin did not interrogate him on where or when he was able to use the rollover camera without being seen. At one point, Danilin did suggest that Cassidy take the material into the men's room to copy it. That was not an option, Cassidy explained. There were no doors on the stalls at Edgewood. I could have taken the documents to my car, he said, but they didn't ask, and I didn't explain. The documents that Cassidy photographed and passed to Danilin were selected by Army intelligence and approved at the highest echelon of the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. One of those who ended up clearing the, quote, feed, unquote, as counterintelligence agents call such material, was John OLoughlin, a former FBI agent who by 1962 had moved over to the Pentagon as the direct result of a diktat, D-I-K-T-A-T, by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. According to Bevels, O'Loughlin ran afoul of Hoover's edict that FBI agents had to meet strict weight standards. Quote, Hoover had a physical and found that his weight was higher than the metropolitan life standard, unquote, Bevels said. He went on a diet and felt so good he decided everyone would have to do it. Tom had a lot of trouble making weight, unquote. The problem with the feed, of course, was the need to balance Cassidy's credibility with the requirements of secrecy. These contradictory demands could never be completely reconciled. As in every such operation, some secrets had to be given away in order to protect the double agent. Officials in Washington were thus passing secret information to the Soviets, the disclosure of which by anyone else could have resulted in a long prison term for violation of the federal espionage laws. The difficult balancing act often led to tensions between the FBI and the Joint Chiefs. The Bureau wanted to keep the Russians convinced by passing significant documents, but the Pentagon was reluctant to part with its classified secrets. Rebels recalled the conflict. Quote, "It was hard to get the military to give us stuff. Sometimes we wanted to put classification stamps on documents that weren't classified, and we had trouble getting clearances from the military even to do that," unquote. The meetings with Danilin almost always took place in the parking lot of a bowling alley in Springfield, Virginia, a Washington suburb. There, Cassidy passed the documents that he had photographed. "We would meet at 9 p.m., always on a Saturday night. I suppose this is when America is out partying and has its guard down." Danilin, overjoyed to have a mole inside Edgewood, urged Cassidy to obtain everything he could on the nerve gas program. He emphasized he wanted as much as possible about chemical formulas and the makeup of the binary system. He would say, "Find me anything you can on binary." He wanted information on all the nerve gases. He asked about VX. He asked about sarin. He asked about GD. Get everything you can about it. After 2 years, and with the Russians well hooked and pushing for every scrap Cassidy could provide, the counterintelligence agents in the FBI decided the moment they were waiting for had arrived. Danilin and the GRU trusted Cassidy. It was time for the deception. And the deception is the name of chapter 6, which will be our next reading of this book, scheduled for Saturday night at 8 p.m. here on Macduff Lives. And a little asterisk about Tom OLoughlin mentioned in the book. Isn't it an interesting little bit of a throw? And I can tell you from what I know, it was a throw. The idea of, let's see, what are you looking at there? Oh, that's the table of contents for the book. Okay. Anyway, I was explaining something about Tom OLoughlin in the book, and that is that my dad always had a trouble with weight, and the idea that that just came to Hoover's attention in 1962 is ridiculous. He was under the gun to keep his weight down from his very first physical with the FBI way back in 1951 or so. And every time he would succeed in getting past the requirements. Hoover was very strict with everyone, but he made an exception for my dad. And the doctors would write on their report, well, he's overweight for a normally framed man, but he is a very big boned and large framed individual. And so it's not really abnormal. And that was going on for years. And I can show you, a half a dozen medical reports in which that interesting comment is made. And there's a little bit of a white out, you know how you take a piece of paper and paste it over something with Scotch tape to make sure you didn't see it? Well, I think that that's covering up somebody very important signature that was signing off on this doctor's report. So it's not because of anything to do with his weight that my father ended up at the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but that seems to be the throw that we're given in this very interesting and exciting book by David Wise called Cassidy's Run, The Secret Spy War Over Nerve Gas. All right, make sure and tune in to Biden's Belton Road, where we'll get a new report from New Orleans and George Webb and the gang down there in just a couple minutes. And thanks again to Aaron Adler for a great production this morning. And we will be with you tonight with a very important show with Paul Gallagher of EIR, one of the great veteran reporters with EIR, who will bring us up to date with his reporting on the Great Reset and the dangers and horrors that are associated in the future if we let this thing happen. Thank you, guys.